listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Radio's authority on the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology, celebrating 25 years of broadcasting. Broadcasting around the world and to the great beyond.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you still from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Send me your emails, xzone at xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, we're at X-Zone Radio TV. And you can listen to the X-Zone 7/24, 365, as well as the show Monday through Friday from 8 p.m. Eastern until midnight at www.xzoneradiotv.com. My guest this hour is Ryan Straub, and he is a spiritual investigator and consultant. While his interest in the paranormal didn't begin when he was young, and he just didn't understand his role in the field until he was 16 years old. He was involved in a car accident where the front of his truck was ripped off during a car accident. Joining me now is Ryan Straub. And Ryan, thanks very much for joining us. And can you tell us more about your indoctrination into the paranormal?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I was, like I said earlier, I was 16 years old, and I was driving the back roads of a small rural Missouri town, and it was snowing pretty bad, and I lost control of my truck when I came to a T intersection because I couldn't see it due to the heavy volume of snow. I actually went off a 6-foot embankment and hit the concrete shards that were on the ground there, and it ripped off the front of the truck. Well, I ended up waking up a couple hours later and realizing that I had to get myself to the nearest house, which happened to be a few miles away. And as I walked from where I had the wreck into this person's house, I started noticing I had horrible migraines. I couldn't hardly focus on anything. I ended up going to the doctor. Everything was fine in the long run. But from that moment on, I began to become more sensitive to the paranormal and things that are around me. And because of that, I started to dedicate my life to understanding the paranormal and the spiritual realm as much as I could.
How did you proceed? How did you learn about the paranormal during this time?
Well, I spent many, many hours in the local library. That was back before the internet was super popular, so it seemed like all the information that I was getting was the knowledge of other people who have had similar experiences before. And my family being very religious, I started talking to them more about the religion aspect of things, which kind of branched off into folklore and occult magics and just spirituality in general. If there was a book on the subject that's even partially related, I was reading it, taking notes. Like I said, I did a lot of investigations with other people, making sure I could learn the most suitable way for me to understand the knowledge that I was acquiring.
And what aspect of the paranormal and the studies that you were doing gravitated to you the most that you found more interesting than any other topic?
Well, originally it was the scientific aspect of the paranormal. Why were we experiencing it? Why were they trying to communicate? Why were we trying to communicate? And then from there, I realized I had more of a niche for understanding and practicing spiritual warfare and spiritual investigation.
Is there a connection between religion and the paranormal?
I believe there is. It's just like the relationship between religion and science. And when I say that is people tend to see them as completely unrelated. Like religion on one side,
Right.
scientific behavior on the other. But to me, I tend to see it as more as, the different branches on the same tree. Just because we understand something through religion and not through science doesn't mean that they don't cooperate. It just means that we may not have, scientific proof for the existence of that particular religious situation. Now, when it comes to the paranormal, I think the paranormal is inclusive to religion, but it's not the only reason that we experience it.
Well said. You and I have to take a commercial break. Please stand by. X-Zone Nation, my guest is Ryan Straub, and he is a spirit investigator and consultant. He is the owner of IIIrd Eye Chronicles spiritual consultation company, and his website is ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. We'll be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X-Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Once again, send me your emails, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. Visit our social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV, and 724-365 X-Zone at xzoneradiotv.com.
You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
Welcome back, everyone. Ryan Straub is our special guest this hour, and we're talking about the paranormal. We're talking about religion. We're going to be talking about Buddhism, Christianity, celestial magic, Jewish magic, Shinto, shamanism, voodoo, and much more this hour. Ryan is the owner of IIIrd Eye Chronicles spiritual consultation company. His website is ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. First of all, what is spiritual warfare and spiritual investigation? What's the difference between the two?
Sure. Spiritual investigation is essentially the application of scientific investigation, but with a few minor adjustments. I tend to use a series of 6 relationships to help to show the consistency between the nature of the claim for the paranormal itself and the case that you're dealing with. And what happens is it helps to show certain consistencies and inconsistencies to help prove the validation of your case. Now, from a spiritual point of view, you're looking for things to help to show whether or not the possibility of the spiritual aspect is beyond the scientific understanding. And what I mean by that is you tend to see a lot of xenonormal phenomenon. And what I mean by that is is natural occurrences that appear paranormal. So, for example, if someone's having a TV turn on and off in the middle of the night, it could just be your electrical issues. That is something that possibly is naturally occurring that is appearing as a supernatural effect. So the idea of spiritual investigation is to take the information that you've seen to be paranormal in nature and finding ways to lean it back towards a scientific explanation of things. Now, spiritual warfare is the collaboration of investigative knowledge combined with spiritual knowledge. For example, your religion, your folklore, your occult information, and then you apply that information based on the situations that you're dealing with from case to case.
How does one's religious belief play into their own paranormal experiences?
Well, typically, if a person is strong in a certain religion, let's say Catholicism, they tend to want to use those techniques or those beliefs and apply them to the situation rather than trying to understand the aspect of the ghost or the spirit itself. That's where the whole square peg versus round hole comes into play. If you are only willing to accept one religion or one spiritual perspective and the ghost or the spirit that you're dealing with is a different one, whatever methods you use will not carry over and they will not work. So unfortunately, when you're dealing with a person who is strict in in their ways, in their religion, or their spiritual practice, it allows for an inconsistency in being able to help that person, because if their knowledge base doesn't apply over to the situational aspect of the case, you tend to find a lot of escalation in your removals or any type of spiritual help that you're trying to do.
Based on the religious practices and spiritual practices that you've studied over the years, Ryan, is there any one religious philosophy that is prone to more paranormal experience than another?
Well, I think that when you get to be believing in the more tribal religions such as voodoo or Druidism or along those lines, it's not that you experience more, but you're willing to believe in the idea of the paranormal more than as you get closer to the more strict monotheistic religions, where they tend to focus on only a certain amount of deities, angels, demons, Holy Spirit, so on and so forth. They tend to create a monotheism or a hierarchy that tends to provide some sort of boundaries. But when you get to these more fluid religions or these fluid types of spirituality, the possibility for the paranormal is more relevant.
Now, when you're doing an investigation, what investigative methods do you use?
Well, excuse me, that really depends on the case itself. But basically, we will go in, we'll do a scientific investigation, which is pretty standard to everyone else's scientific investigation. But as I mentioned earlier, I use a series of 6 relationships to try to prove or disprove the validity of this case. And for example, one of the relationships is the person versus the claim. And what I mean by that is, does the behavior or the appearance of that person match the claim that they're saying? So if a person says, I've got this ghost in my house, it's keeping me up all night, and it's been doing it for weeks, but when you look at this person, there's no signs of fatigue, there's no signs of anxiety, there's no signs attributed to the symptoms of sleep deprivation, you know that there's an inconsistency in their story. So it's basically a lot of initial psychological methods that we tend to apply that make our form of investigation different from a lot of other groups.
Now, how many are there in your group that actually go on the investigation, and what are their responsibilities?
Well, we have several groups across the United States, but typically the groups run from 4 to 6 people, and we tend to have a person who does technology-based information, and that's the person who will standardize your EVPs, your communication with the person recording, that type of thing. We have a person who does background information and history of location to try to validate the claims that a person's saying. We have another person who tends to deal strictly with the spiritual aspect of application, which is what I tend to do. And then the other people in the group tend to help as an aid in general investigation.
How long would a typical, if there is such a thing, a typical paranormal investigation take from the time you enter the premise to do your initial investigation and your interview with the people to the day that you return with your summary and conclusions?
Well, I like to do more than one investigation just because it doesn't mean that you investigate once you're going to catch everything that's there. You could go to the same place 10 or 15 different times and nothing happened. Then you can go to a place randomly once and see everything that there is to offer. So it really depends on the situational, the case that we're dealing with. But initially what I'd like to do is I usually meet with the client outside of the location. And that conversation, that interview usually takes about an hour. And we talk about themselves. We talk about what they're experiencing. We tend to talk about life in general, because by doing that, we establish a baseline of what they feel and how they can react to normal situations before putting them into a paranormal one. And then from there, we do the investigation. And like I said, that depends on the size of the house, what we're looking for exactly, so on and so forth. So on average, I would say it takes between 6 and 8 hours. It's broken up over a period of a couple days.
Do you do the investigation strictly at night, or do you break it up between the daytime and the nighttime?
I do break it up between the day and the night because the paranormal doesn't have an alarm clock. So Sometimes it can happen during the day, sometimes it happen at night. The idea of, I believe that the reason why people tend to go out and experience ghostly behavior at night stems from the TV shows and their ratings. But like I said earlier, it's one of those things where it can happen any time of the day.
Right. What, in your opinion, is the most frequent cause of a family haunting?
Honestly, it depends on what you're trying to deal with in general, because the most common thing is misrepresentation. They want to believe that something's going on, so they tend to look for signs and signals and omens of what's actually happening that it turns out to be xenonormal phenomenon. But when you're actually dealing with a haunted case, it could be anything from, the people that are living are not ready to let go of the person that has passed. So by them holding on so tightly, they tend to draw that ghost back into the house, and the ghost trying to communicate and doesn't really know how to do that per se, which tends to lead to haunting behavior.
I've been told by many spiritualists as well as paranormal investigators and channels that many ghosts don't know they're dead. And my question is, how can someone be dead and not know they're dead?
Well, if the situation is tragic or quick, it may be something that you don't have the time to perceive. If you're out driving your car and all of a sudden you're blindsided by something, and you die instantly at the scene, you may not have the situational consciousness to understand exactly what happened to you at that time. Even though that may be one reason behind a million, the consciousness and the perception of people is a very strange and unique thing. That's why when you look at some people with mental disorders, such as, people who have psychomatic disorders, where they believe something is wrong with them so much that it actually manifests in their body. It could be similar to that concept.
All right, but what I mean is that if a ghost has been haunting, let's say for 30, 40, 50 years, or in the case of the Gettysburg area or any of the war-torn areas within the United States, Canada, wherever, and this ghost is around, wouldn't they get the hint after, let's say, the first year that they can't talk to anybody, they're being totally ignored, they don't need to eat anymore, they're having problems with their communication skills to the living? Wouldn't this be a sign that you're dead?
Well, it depends on the consciousness of the ghost itself. Depending on whether it's an intelligent ghost or recording. For example, if it's carrying out the same act over and over and over again, most likely it's just the disembodied energy caught in a loop. Therefore, its consciousness is no longer there. It's just the action that it plays out over and over. For example, like a lot of the deaths in Gettysburg. However, if it is an intelligent haunting and it's haunting a location and it can't communicate, it can't talk, instead of, passing on because it doesn't know how to exactly, that's why things tend to escalate. That could be a reason why these aggravated or aggressive hauntings happen.
Ryan, stand by. You and I have to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. Exo Nation, Ryan Straub is our special guest this hour. He is the owner of IIIrd Eye Chronicles Spiritual Consultation Company. His website is ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. And Ryan and I will be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Email me, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, on all social media sites, Xzone Radio TV, and our radio site at xzoneradiotv.com. Don't go away now. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
Ryan Straub is our guest this hour, Exonation. He is the owner of IIIrd Eye Chronicles Spiritual Consultation Company. His website is ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. You know, I have to laugh, Ryan, because sometimes we get people who come on the show who are very religious. They have deep religious ties and roots. And they kind of get a little upset when you start, talking about the paranormal and how certain philosophies embrace the paranormal while others just ignore it. Because when you look at the Bible, for example, that book is filled with paranormal activity. And yet some parts of Christianity grasp it, others, well, you can't talk about that because that's the work of the devil. So how do you, as a spiritual consultant and investigator, balance this out?
Well, the reason why I've studied so many different religions and spiritual practices is because I haven't found one that's all-encompassing. They all tend to have very similar paths, but they all tend to lack things that other religions or folklore or spiritual perspectives they thrive on. And as you mentioned, it depends on which religion we're talking about, but most of them tend to, in my opinion, pick and choose what they want to use to fit their situation or their storyline the best. And if it goes against that storyline, it's the work of the ultimate evil, the person that we shouldn't say his name. But when you're dealing with the paranormal and you're dealing with spirituality, being well-rounded and not so rigid tends to give you more opportunities to help people, because not every situation is going to be a cookie-cutter situation.
Yeah, nothing is cut and dry in the paranormal, is it?
Not at all. It would make it a lot easier if it was.
Yeah, but then it would be too easy and nobody'd be interested in it, right? Listen, what is, in your opinion, what is the difference between ghosts and spirits?
Okay. First of all, the best way to look at that is to imagine a Venn diagram. On the left side of the diagram is the material realm. Those are the things that we tend to experience with our material senses. Mm-hmm. Touch, taste, smell, hearing, sight. While on the other side of that spectrum, you have the spiritual world. Now, the interesting aspect is the overlap between the two. That would be the energetic plane or the threshold that people always seem to talk about. Now, when it comes to ghosts are something that stems from the material realm. A person that's lived, an animal that's lived and died, and the energy is become disembodied and therefore is trapped or experienced through our material senses. While a spirit is something that's never been born or existed solely on the material realm. That's your angels, your demons, your fae, or any other type of non-earthly entity that you hear about in any religion. The difference between the two primarily is where they come from. And even though those terms tend to be used simultaneously or, one established of the other, that vernacular is incorrect, because what's happening is you're actually giving different characteristics to each one. A ghost, for example, tends to deal with attachments and dealing with attaching onto people. A ghost cannot possess anyone. That is something that spirits do based on the energy and the collaborations they have to control it. So, like I said, it mostly depends on where they come from and how people perceive them.
What's the difference between attachments, possession, and conduits?
Okay. As we mentioned earlier, an attachment is where a ghost forms a bond, and it's usually not voluntary. And what happens is that bond where they attach to a person, a place, an object, they tend to, it's like two magnets stuck together. Now, the problem when that happens, if a person has an attachment, they tend to show signs of something called ghost sickness, which tends to be fatigued. They can be more frustrated, they tend to be breaking down on a physical level. Now, when it comes to possession, that's something that the spirits that we talked about do, angels, demons, fae, any along those lines. And what they tend to do is they tend to take control of that person's self. They tend to alter the mind and the perception of that individual and turning them into something that's unrecognizable to their former being. Now, a conduit is a person who either voluntary or involuntary allows the communication from one entity through them. Now, typically it's through a meditative state, which the person, even if it is involuntary, has the ability to break it through their willpower. It's not something that is possession because it's not something that they can't control. It's more on the lines of they're giving temporary speaker formation for whatever spirit is controlling them. So that's the difference between those three.
Is it possible to bring a spirit or an evil spirit into your home without knowing it? By example, going to a flea market, buying a piece of antique furniture, bringing it into the house, or having somebody come into the house that you just don't know enough about, and they enter the house, they bring a spirit, and the spirit decides to say, hey, you know, this is a pretty nice house. I think I'm going to stay here.
It's possible. It's more common with ghosts, since ghosts tend to attach to people or objects more frequently than spirits do. However, typically that is something that when it occurs, it's pretty noticeable because things start happening, your general haunting starts happening, or if it is a spirit, they tend to cause more mischief and issues such as violent nightmares or hallucinations. So yeah, it is possible. It's rare.
But it is possible. How important or how effective are the tools that we see based on television here that exorcists use? For example, the cross, holy water. Do they really work when it comes to an exorcism?
Well, they tend to work when you're dealing with Christian-based deities. You know, if you're dealing with, you know, a Hindu spirit that's taken possession of somebody, typically the cross and the holy water is not going to affect them. So that's why it relates back to what we talked about earlier, where you have to have more than one avenue of knowledge, because you have to understand what you're dealing with before you can fix it. It's kind of like if you want to try to get a splinter out of your finger, instead of using tweezers, you're using a hammer. You may get it out eventually, but you're going to break a lot of things in the process.
Yeah. Over the years, how many investigations do you approximate you and your teams have done?
Oh, wow. We try to do, on average, 100 a year. Mm-hmm. So I've been doing this for 15 years, so I would say we've probably done close to 1,000.
Is there any one investigation that sticks out in your mind more than any other? And can you share that investigation with us?
Yeah, there are a few that I've dealt with on rare occasions, but there was a story where we went out and we were doing an investigation from a guy who called us saying that he has been waking up in the middle of the night feeling like people are grabbing onto him and waking him up. And we were out there, we were talking to him, and he's saying that he's waking up with bruises, he's waking up with scratches, and it's causing him to have hardly any sleep, and when he does sleep, he's having horrible nightmares. So we go into his house, and we set up an investigation. We put up a camera in his room while he's sleeping, and we're doing an investigation in other parts of the house. Well, the guy who's sitting in front of the camera is watching him, and all of a sudden he shoots out of bed, screaming in horrible pain. And we run in the room, and we turn on the light, and he has gotten bitten on the middle of his back, which was not there before. And it's starting to bruise, it's starting to swell. And while we were talking to him, we see handprints starting to show up on his body. And as we're doing the research on the house, we found out that the couple who lived there before the man had actually was abusing his wife, was biting her, was slapping her, was punching her, doing horrible things to this poor woman. And then when she said that she was going to leave him, he killed her and then himself. So when this guy moved in years later, he was experiencing the same thing that she was doing, that she was experiencing while she was alive.
Oh my gosh! How do you?
It was horrible.
Yeah. How do you and your team protect yourself from any of the negative entities or the spirits or the negative forces that you encountered during these investigations?
The people who are in the group, they tend to have particular talismans or oils or prayer that they like to invoke before they go into situations. And what we tend to do is we tend to overlap them. For example, if we have 4 people in the group, one will do one for everybody, and then so on and so forth down the line. That way we all have more than one avenue of protection.
Interesting. What kind of, you said that you used video cameras. Do you use any other kind of equipment?
I use, like I said, most of my tools are spiritual, but the team tends to use your standard video camera, audio recorder. But the problem with equipment, in my opinion, is there is not a single piece of equipment that was actually created for paranormal research. It's all been adapted over, like the digital camera, the audio recorder, the EMF detector. And the problem is we don't know exactly how to quantify spiritual energy. So by using equipment that we think is occurring based off scientific principles that we think could be the cause for the paranormal, we're just kind of grasping at straws. Now, don't get me wrong. Those types of equipment are important, but in my opinion, the most important piece of equipment that you can use going into a situation is your mind. You know, if you can stay logical, if you can stay scientific, if you can apply methods that you've learned to try to deduce the truth behind the situation, that's more important than trying to snap photos in the dark or sit around in a circle and listen to an audio recorder. So, like I said, my tech guy has a bunch of equipment, but we tend to focus primarily on application of that equipment rather than how fancy it is.
I've heard a lot of investigators and channels and mediums and psychics and those who actually go into different houses to assist people in their need of help when it comes to a paranormal activity that is going on. They use they say one of the best ways to clear a house is to smudge it, and I understand that smudging is a Native American. What's the word I'm looking for here? Technique that has been used over the many years to clear away spirits. What is your take on that?
It works to an extent. Like I said, it depends on what you're trying to deal with. Now, typically the most common smudge that people use is sage. Sage is not a cure-all, you know, and it seems like a lot of people tend to use it as one. Sage is used to remove negative emotion and negative energies in a location or from a person. It doesn't usually get rid of entities. In my opinion, if you're going to deal with using smudge, I tend to use Palo Santo. Palo Santo actually translates as holy stick, and it's been used for many, many years to purify and bless locations of all entities and all energies rather than just move them along. Smudging tends to be one of the most common ways to do things, and given the right practice, it can be effective.
Why is there so much emphasis by many of the people that I've had on the show that they want to keep ties to the Native Americans and their traditions of getting rid of spirits? And, you know, it seems that they're looked at as the patron saint of ghost hunters.
Yeah, it could be because, you know, it's mystical and it's easy to obtain knowledge about. You know, it's a lot easier to go out and get a book on shamanism and understand the benefits of using herbal medicine and shamanic practices rather than it is to dive into something like voodoo. Voodoo tends to have both good and negative connotations, and a lot of times that tends to scare people away from it.
Well,
shamanism is... Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask you, isn't that a common factor when it comes to the paranormal? There is a good side and an evil side?
Right, but when you're trying to get rid of the good and the evil, you tend to do something that is a little more forgiving. And the reason why I say that is a lot of new people who have seen various movies or various TV shows, the things that they tend to jump to are the things that are the most, to them, the easiest to obtain. So that would be sage. That would be, your books on the Native Americans who... Shamanism and the shamans themselves have always had some sort of mystical backing behind them. They were the medicine men, the cure-alls. They were the people who, they provided insight. And, since it's typically in the United States, they tend to see it as close to home and something that they could practice versus, ancient Celtic Druidism, who, those people who had very mystical beliefs, who were very shamanistic in nature, but they tend to be more guarded in their information.
Ryan, you and I have to take our final break for this hour. Please stand by. Exonation Ryan Straub is my guest this hour. www.ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. That's www.ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Eye Chronicles. And Ryan and I will be back on the other side of this break as we wrap up this hour here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, from our studios right here in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.
You're listening to the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
Ryan Straub is his name, and spiritual and religious paranormal activity is his game. His website is ryanstraub.wix.com/IIIrd Chronicles. First of all, Ryan, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's been great having you with us. A very interesting man you are, young man, and we'll have to have you back on, as I said during the break, because we still have so much to cover. But before we go tonight, can you tell us about self-eradication and why people should not attempt this?
Sure. This is actually a pretty big problem that I've seen growing in the last few years, and primarily that's because of the popularity and growth in the paranormal itself. People tend to go out, they try to solve their own problems, which I understand that's something they want to do, but a lot of these people they tend to try to solve problems from their own point of view instead of trying to adapt them for the case themselves. And what happens is they tend to use methods that are incorrect, because, not saying that their perspective is wrong, but like we mentioned earlier, using Christian Christian methods on Hindu entities is not going to work, and they're going to see it as a hit to them or sacrilegious to them or whatever the case may be. These things tend to escalate, and the problem is people are getting hurt. I've had cases recently where, a guy thought he was going to get rid of this ghost out of his house. It just happened to be moving things around and talking to him, and he tried to get rid of the entity by doing what he thought would work, which unfortunately was yelling at it and burning sage, and he ended up being pushed down a flight of stairs.
Oh my gosh!
It's just, escalation is something that's very, very, very common in do-it-yourself eradications and removals. And, you know, I'm not saying that I'm an expert in everything, but you need to go to people who know what they're doing. It's kind of like if you have an electrical problem, you know, and you're a plumber, just because you can fix things in your expertise doesn't mean that you can try to do things in another field of expertise. You know, I'm a barber, and I'm not going to go out and try to build someone's house because it would fall down around them. So I urge everybody, even though you have something going on and you may not want to talk to other people about it, I ask you as many times as I can, please find someone who is willing to help you and willing to understand the situation. And if they don't know how to help you, you know, groups, please reach out. There's always someone there that's willing to help, willing to teach. If you have any questions, you can always contact me. And, you know, I'll be honest with you. If there's something that I don't know, I'll find someone until I get the adequate answer, you know, and that's what we have to do. You know, we have to evolve as investigators.
Ryan, we have to say so long for tonight, but before we do, let our listeners know how they can contact you or find out more about you.
Yeah, you can contact me via the website or via the email. My email is IIIrd Chronicles @gmail.com. So you can contact me there or through the website that you've mentioned several times.
Ryan, take care of yourself. I look forward to the next time when you're with us, because I would love to talk to you about voodoo as well as Jewish magic and so many of the other interesting things that you bring to the table when you visit somebody doing paranormal investigations like you do. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in the future.
All right, Ryan. Take care, buddy. We'll be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada.